Tim, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Right, hello again. A lot's happened since this time last year. That piece of paper that went around wasn't really meant to go around. I was just showing this lady here, but it is in fact an old soldier. That is the sort of soldier that fought. Obviously, they'd invented photography by the time that was done, and they hadn't in 1815. That's for certain. It's a strange. We keep trying to compare that with now, and this talk is a bit of a bungee rope talk. So it starts with Waterloo and all the things that progressed from it. Everything has a connection back to the Battle of Waterloo, sometimes particularly tenuous, but I make no apology for that because I wouldn't have much of a talk without a bit of tenuousness. And it has no structure. It's just whatever I think of next, I'll tell you about. There's no script. And so it's one of those. Anything could happen. Who's timing me? Who's telling me when to shut up? I need at least 10 minutes notice because I should be in the middle of some story.
Okay.
It's always the facts. Right, okay, so where do we begin? Well, you all know that there was a battle on the 18th of June 1815. It was a Sunday, nobody had gone to church. They were all out having a good fight. We keep saying it was in Belgium, but Belgium didn't exist in 1815. It was in the southern part of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Wallonia district, where they were French-speaking Catholics as opposed to the Flemish people in the north, who were Flemish-speaking Protestants. And it wasn't until 1836 that Belgium actually came into existence. So all the people who talk about where was the battle fought, it was fought in Belgium. Well, no, it wasn't really. Typically, it was fought in the south part of Holland. But that's a moot point. At the end of the battle, there were an awful lot of very upset people and a huge number of dead ones. And so the first thing that was the priority, there were two things really. One was to get the armies back into some sort of shape, because although we now know it was the last major battle of the Napoleonic Wars, they of course did not. That's the nice thing about history. It provides you with 20/20 hindsight. So the first thing Wellington and Blucher had to do is draw their forces together, such as were left, and get them straightened out. Now, they couldn't possibly do that quickly because of the utter mess that was made. So on the 19th, they pulled themselves together. And so farriers, the horses that were wounded, were shot and their shoes were removed because nothing was wasted. The Battle of Waterloo was a military event. There's no other way to describe it. It was purely military. As soon as the last gunfire died down, it became a political, economic, and social event because everybody was trying then in some way or another to cash in on it. Cash, not in the money sense, but cash in on fame, fortune, reputation, either to enhance or to protect or to deny. So the stories that come out are all to be taken with a slight pinch of salt. People's memories do vary. Who said that? The Queen. Yes, that's right. And it's true. And people ascribe to their own actions an importance way beyond what happened. Because if you fire your musket and suddenly a whole regiment fires back, you think, I caused that. Well, you didn't. The officer in charge of that regiment over there caused it, but you're entitled to think it was your fault. So Wellington in particular had to put his army together. He got about 15,000 casualties spread over the battlefield, and they had to drag them out, get them sorted out. And although the night before the battle, it had absolutely flogged it down, the day after the battle, the sun came out and it was hot. Now, if you lay an awful lot of dead people and a lot of dead horses about in June heat, not this particular June we've just had, but June then, the inevitable happens. And the place gets hotter and hotter, the bodies get blacker and blacker, and the stench gets awfuler and awfuler. So they needed to bury the dead quickly. The horses were burned, and not a few soldiers were burned as well, just pitched onto the fire. By and large, they got the local Belgian peasants. They sort of dragooned them into burying the dead. Now, the peasants weren't best pleased because, first of all, the entire battle had chewed up their harvest fields. It was fought in fields of corn, and the corn in those days grew as high as me. And this explains why wounded soldiers were crawling out of the battlefield, up to 2 weeks after the battle, not because anybody had left them there on purpose. They simply couldn't see them because of the high corn. So the peasants were not only deprived of their crop and therefore their winter food, they were now being obliged to bury the dead as well. So they didn't take too kindly to that, and it wasn't done particularly well. Shortly after the battle, a rainstorm exposed a number of limbs sticking up in the air, rather like grotesque statues. But nonetheless, Wellington got his army on the move. Blucher got his army on the move much quicker because he'd had less casualties. And Napoleon had got his army on the move in completely the wrong direction and more or less unarmed. In other words, they were running like hell. The only bit that wasn't was Grouchy's little troop of 30,000 men. Now, on the morning of the 19th, nobody thought to tell Grouchy that the French had lost the battle. So they were still in fighting order. Now, the Prussians knew, because somebody galloped across the 8-mile gap and said, "We won, we won." But nobody told the French. So the Prussians started to march back on their main regiments and were absolutely amazed when the French attacked them. They couldn't believe it. And it wasn't until well into the day, with the French really beating the crap out of the Prussians, that some news came through that all wasn't as it should be. And Grouchy had to change his mind very quickly. And although he was an absolute awful marshal during the battle, he then produced a brilliant withdrawal and saved his men from annihilation. So they advanced. The Prussians on one flank, Wellington's army on the other. Now, Wellington needed to tell somebody. He needed to tell the British government. So he sat down on the evening of the 18th and started to compose his report. But he was, in fact, absolutely shattered. He'd been in a saddle for something like 18 hours, non-stop, and couldn't do it. So he got some sleep, as much as he could. And the following day, so this is now Monday, the 19th, he finished off writing his report. And when he'd written it, it is a turgid document. You have to read it about 3 times to make sure that he is reporting a victory, because it's not immediately obvious, especially with a list of dead and wounded officers, which is long. He then gave it to the next person whose turn it was to take news of a victory home to England, who turned out to be one Major Henry Percy, the Honourable Henry Percy of the Percy Earls of Northumberland. And Percy was a major. Percy's got a colourful history. He was captured by the French in 1809 and incarcerated. And his incarceration was so severe that he managed to father 2 children by a Frenchwoman and look after them. They subsequently came to England. And this is the bungee rope effect now. One of them became a civil servant and disappeared into the morass of the civil service. But the other one, Henry, the elder boy, grew up to be a soldier. Now, both boys were called Marion Durand. The surname was Marion Durand, which was the name of the lady who Henry Percy had cohabited with. That's a good word, isn't it? Cohabited with. And he rose up to be a lieutenant general in the Indian Army. And he died, brace yourselves, when he fell off an elephant. That's something that doesn't appear on most post-mortem reports. Cause of death, falling off elephant. What actually happened was that the elephant, he was in a howdah on top of an elephant. And you remember all these silly, it still happens today when a double-decker bus goes under a bridge that's too low, you top off the double-decker. Well, the elephant went through a bridge which was too low and took off the howdah. And old Henry fell to the ground and never recovered. So death by falling off an elephant. I bet you've not heard that before. Percy was given the document, Wellington's dispatch, and he had been present, young Henry, at the Duchess of Richmond's ball the night before all the shenanigans kicked off, on the 15th. And his date, his partner, had given him the most unmilitary-looking little pouch, silk pouch, a sort of handkerchief pouch or some such, militarily useless. But by some freak, the dispatch exactly fitted it. So Henry popped the dispatch into this pouch and set forth for England. Now, bear in mind now, we're well into Monday. Off he went, and he was taking with him the only 2 eagles, the French eagles, that the British Army managed to capture that day, both of them during the charge. There's a picture here somewhere. There he is. We'll get to these in a bit. That's the capture of one of the French eagles. We called them chickens. as a disparaging term, but only 2 captured the whole day. The French were quite prepared to sacrifice enormous numbers of lives to protect their eagles, because they'd been presented to every battalion and squadron by the Emperor himself. Anyway, Percy got these 2 eagles and set forth on his horse. Now, of course, he had to get to the coast, so that took some time. And when he got to the coast, he had to then get a boat. And the boat that he got was called HMS Peruvian, an 18-gun brig sloop, commanded by a Captain White. Take me to England. I've got great news. So they hauled sail and set off. They got halfway across the channel, and it happens to all of us. You're in a hurry. So every damn traffic light is red. You're an hour in front of time. Every traffic light's green. Well, the sea and the wind do that. You got halfway across the channel and became utterly becalmed. So Percy's now got the most important news of the century so far in his pocket and cannot do anything with it. Apparently, he marched up and down the boat, probably cussing the wind, and there wasn't a breath. They put every possible sail on this boat. Didn't move for hours and hours and hours and hours, like it was Wednesday. So in the end, the log says of the ship, out brig. And they launched a cutter. And the captain and Percy, who'd rowed for Oxford, and 4 burly sailors rowed this thing 35 miles to England. This is with the tide and all the rest of it. And they did it in a few hours because of the tide. You know, this is the boat race gone mad. They rowed for their lives. And they rocked up in England with the Eagles. And of course, then they've got to get to London. Well, okay, they hired a coach and off they went. And apparently they galloped along with an eagle sticking out of each window. So now we're well into Wednesday now, and still no news. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, they woke our Prime Minister up at 4:30 in the morning to tell him, right? So the news was about half an hour old. The news of Waterloo is already 48 hours and counting old. It gets to London with the captain, and they have to, by etiquette demands, that they go and find the Secretary of State for the Wars and the Colonies, one Lord Bathurst. Where is Lord Bathurst? He's having his dinner. Right. Where's he having his dinner? Well, in those days, everybody went to somebody else to have dinner. You didn't dine at home. You went round to some knob's house and had dinner. And then they came round to your house and you had dinner and all the rest of it. So they went and found Earl Bathurst. Earl Bathurst news. Right, we must tell the Prime Minister. Oh, God. By now, people are beginning to realise that there's a coach outside with an eagle sticking out of each window. And the general idea is that they're gathering that something really momentous has happened and that we've actually won a battle against Napoleon. So now there's a coach, Percy, Captain White, 2 eagles, and a whole lot of folk. They go see the Prime Minister, whose reaction is, we must tell the Prince Regent. Oh, for God's sake, can't you tell him? No, you've got to tell him. So now we've got Lord Bathurst, the Prime Minister, a coach, 2 eagles, Percy, White, and a whole lot of people, growing all the time, going round to find the Prince Regent. Well, the Prince Regent was having dinner with a Mr. and Mrs. Bohème. Now, Mrs. Bohème was a social climber of the highest rank, and she'd waited years to get the Prince Regent to one of her dinners. And there he was, and tickled she was to death, when suddenly there's this monumental clattering and banging and shouting and charging. In through the door comes Percy. Now, bear in mind, he's still wearing the uniform that he fought in at Waterloo 3 days ago. So he's a tad whiffy by now. So they knew he was coming, not by the noise. Anyway, that's another thing. He burst in, marched up to the Prince Regent, put the eagles on the ground and said, "Victory, sir, victory!" And the Prince Regent, being a delicate soul of about 24 stone, immediately had a hissy fit and, Mrs. Bohème was furious. Because at that point, the Prince Regent and some of his cronies went in the back room and read the dispatch. Then they read it again, until eventually the penny dropped that we'd won. And then it all went home. Send for the carriage. Everybody went home. The band went home and they'd been paid to be there. Mrs. Bohème was furious, absolutely beside herself. Years later, when she was widowed, she wrote in her diary, "You'd have thought Henry Percy could have left it till the morning to come and disturb everybody with the news. Oh, Mrs. Bohem, come on." But there you are. That's how the news got to the Prince Regent. It didn't get to Edinburgh until several more days had elapsed. You know, we, even us oldies, me oldies, you younger, me oldie, can't understand communication being anything more than lightning speed. It took days. Another example, the Battle of Trafalgar was won on October the 21st. Okay, October the 21st. News got to London on November the 6th. Because the first thing they had to do was come ashore. The news had to come ashore. And the carrier pigeon was having an off day, I think. Anyway, that's how it worked. Just who it was. Henry Percy then went round to the stately home of the Earls of Northumberland, took off his clothes, and when he took off the red sash of an officer, somebody's brains fell onto the floor because he'd been walking around with those in his sash for 3 or 4 days. Percy was a sad case. Here he is. Waterloo Messenger, the life of Henry Percy.
Are these the Percys that are still there at Alnwick?
Yes. Oh, yeah, they're the Percy Earls of Northumberland.
Yes.
But he was a bit of a rogue.
Still the same family.
Yeah, oh, definitely, yes. Having fathered 2 children outside of wedlock, shall we say.
He went and had some in wedlock.
No, he didn't. He never got married. He was given a rotten borough. He became a member of Parliament. He was given a rotten borough. Actually, that sounds very familiar with what's just happened. Anyway, by the by, he only spoke once in... Calm yourselves. He only spoke once in Parliament, and he died very young. He was only in his early 40s. And that's sort of his autobiography, and it doesn't tell us why he died. Nobody knows. The symptoms are described, but it's a disease that nobody knew of. It's some form of malaria, most people think. But anyway, he died very young, and he was a total washout. And even his son died falling off an elephant. And that was Henry Percy for you. I want to tell you about some other people who were present at the Battle of Waterloo and what happened to them. George Rose was present at the Battle of Waterloo. He joined the army in 1809, and he joined a Scottish regiment, the 73rd Regiment of Foot, and served throughout the early part of the Napoleonic Wars and washed up at Waterloo, standing in the ranks, a private soldier standing in the ranks. And at some point in the earlier stages of the day, he got a gunshot wound in the arm, which almost certainly saved his life because he was allowed to go to the rear, and the regiment, the battalion, had the crap shot out of it. There was a huge percentage of death and disorder. But George survived, and not only survived, he thrived. And the reason he thrived was, very simply, he was a primitive Methodist. So he didn't. Are there any primitive Methodists here? There aren't any primitive Methodists anymore. They mixed and merged back with the Methodists again years ago. But he didn't drink. He didn't do drugs of any sort. And he didn't fornicate. He was married, he had a couple of children, and he was faithful to them. Eventually, he served all over the Mediterranean. I've got his discharge papers, or a copy of them, which I'm going to pass around because it's quite interesting. How are you at reading 19th century scribble? Don't try and write this down. And George was promoted corporal eventually, and eventually promoted sergeant. Nothing particularly strange about that, except George wasn't white. There was a rule, if you were an escaped slave and you joined the British Army, after you'd served your term, you were free, regardless. Now, as it turns out, it didn't matter because slavery was abolished while George was in the army. But George was of Negro origin. At one stage, he was the highest ranking Negro in the British Army. And that is quite amazing because he would have been given orders to white soldiers and they would have thought nothing of it. He was entitled so to do. He was duly retired. He went for a time to live in Glasgow, where he preached his Methodism, and eventually went back to where he came from, which was the capital of Jamaica in those days was called Spanish Town. And he went home to Spanish Town and lived his life out there. But when you read the description, he's got dark curly hair, black curly hair, black eyes, and it describes him as a copper bronze coloured skin. So he wasn't entirely Negro black, but he was a slave. He was born a slave, rocked up in the British Army, got his freedom, and survived on quite a reasonable pension of £50 a year, which was not, I know, not inconsiderable in those days. So he was there. Now, John Dawson wasn't at the Battle of Waterloo. Now, I know if I tell you all the people who weren't there, we'll be here till the crack of doom. The difference is, of course, John Dawson was supposed to be there, and he was conspicuous by his absence. He was a member of the 23rd Light Dragoons. That regiment had taken part in the Battle of Quatre Bras, where we held off Marshal Ney's advance, and being a cavalry regiment, was also present during the retreat on the 17th of June, when we withdrew our troops, or Wellington withdrew his troops, from Quatre Bras to the Mont Saint-Jean, what's known as the Waterloo position. Now, under Norse, the army tends to take a very dim view of people who do not rock up for battles. You know, it's absent without leave or absence in the face of the enemy. They don't like it. It encourages other people to do the same thing. Now, in any other circumstance, poor Mr. Dawson would have been dragged before the colonel of the regiment, would have received a fair trial and then taken out and shot. However, this could not happen in this case, because John Dawson was the colonel of the regiment. And that's why he was conspicuously absent. He was supposed to sit on his horse in front of everybody else. You can imagine the troopers thinking politely, where on earth is he? Where's the colonel? Why is the colonel not here? He never lived it down. He had to resign in disgrace. He did rock up towards the end of the battle and take part in the final charge. He went with the 18th Hussars, but by then his reputation was entirely ruined. And nobody knows, because he never told anybody, why he was late. People suggested it was because his servant didn't wake him up, and he'd been on the pot the night before. Well, he was Irish. Oh, I didn't tell you, he was the second Earl of Portarlington. It wasn't just the colonel of the regiment, he was an Irish peer, the second Earl of Portarlington. The significance of Irish peers is they couldn't sit in the House of Lords. They were peers right enough, but they couldn't sit in the Lords. So we've got this colonel of the regiment, an Irish peer, and he's not rocked up to the battle. So anyway, he lived in disgrace. He was a great friend of the Prince Regent, the future George IV, who was known as Prinny. And Prinny took mercy on him and made him one of his aides-de-camp. Now, once you're an aide-de-camp to the Prince Regent, you are automatically given the rank of colonel. So John Dawson went from being a colonel to being a pariah back to being a colonel again, but he never lived it down. And the phrase, he died with unmarried and without issue, although I think he had a lot of issues, to be absolutely honest, but he died unmarried, and he died penniless because he drank and gambled his money away. Died penniless in a London slum in the 1860s, which is a sort of bit of a fabled tale for not, if you don't want to rock up at a battle, then, you know, that's the sort of thing that can happen.